Hi, everyone. I hope you've all had a good week and your projects are progressing well. Thanks for making the time today. Today's digital mentoring session is about safeguarding. We've had a few questions come up regarding research conduct and safeguarding in previous sessions. So I decided to focus on that topic today so we can work towards developing a shared approach to safeguarding as a network. The session today is going to be split into 3 parts. The first is going to be me talking to you about safeguarding, including the importance of it in an international development research context. We're then going to split the group into breakout rooms to discuss risk and mitigation strategies from your experiences before we come back and think jointly about our understanding of vulnerabilities and safeguarding as a network, hopefully agreeing on some kind of working definition that we can use moving forward. I'll start by sharing my screen. Does anyone have any points they would like to raise or questions before we begin? No? Let me just... Can everyone see that? Nice. There's a hiccup right now, is there? Sorry, I'm gonna... Can you see the presentation progressing right now? There's a slight problem, isn't there? Okay, I might need to stop sharing and then restart again. Not sure what happened there. Here we go. Okay. Right. So everyone involved in international research, from research funders, planners, and practitioners to local community members, has the right to be safe from harm. And safeguarding is the process that ensures that we are protecting people's health, well-being, and human rights. The UK Collaborative on Development Research, the UK CDR, defines safeguarding as preventing and addressing any sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment of research participants, communities, and research staff, plus any broader forms of violence, exploitation, and abuse, such as bullying, psychological abuse, and physical violence. As a research network, we understand safeguarding to mean protecting people, including children and at-risk adults, from harm that arises from our research projects, including the design and implementation of projects and the conduct of project teams. So we consider safeguarding to apply to all people involved in and connected to the research. There are many different ways to frame safeguarding, and you may be using different terms such as protection, safety, respect, or research integrity to describe similar concepts. And what we want to do today is to identify core values related to safeguarding in our projects and discuss to what extent our current practices do or don't support those values. So the overall goal of the session is to discuss how we can create research processes that ensure that everyone who comes into contact with our work is treated fairly and with dignity and respect. What's the purpose of safeguarding? In recent years, there has been a number of high-profile cases of abuse involving staff in international NGOs, which led to safeguarding concerns becoming a priority for donors and organizations that are funding and providing services to vulnerable groups. This in turn led to a number of initiatives within international development programs and research, such as the UKI, the United Kingdom Research Initiative, requesting guidance on safeguarding in an international development context specifically. At the same time, new funding opportunities, such as the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is the funder of the Rights for Time network, have encouraged a range of new actors, NGOs and private sector actors, individuals like yourself, to review common practices on safeguarding and recognize the strengths and weaknesses of policies and partnerships across the humanitarian sector. It is generally recognized that a lot of progress has been made in this area in recent years. Nonetheless, the nature of research on humanitarian protection presents specific situations in which abuses of power may occur and therefore requires tailored frameworks and approaches. While safeguarding is relevant to all research projects, those looking at humanitarian protection by nature foreground safeguarding risks, which underlines the importance of clear response pathways, training, and guidance on safeguarding to support decision-making in the work that we do. And in order to develop ethics principles and integrity guidance specifically for international development research and our work, it is imperative that networks like Rights for Time share their experiences, processes, and practices regarding safeguarding and draw on the wealth of knowledge of their partners and everyone engaged with the network. So what are safeguarding challenges? Doing no harm requires gaining information about what potential harms may be, which may not always be immediately apparent. Risk and vulnerabilities are present everywhere, but these can be exacerbated in resource-poor settings or fragile and conflict-affected areas. And since research projects and settings vary widely, safeguarding concerns do too, and are difficult to define across contexts, but are generally shaped by power relations and the specific setting that the research is conducted in. Hence, there is a need to focus on and evolve our understanding of concepts of vulnerability, risk, harm, and power relations that are relevant to carrying out or participating in research. There are some instances in which power structures are very clearly defined and obvious, such as when international workers exercise power over vulnerable populations, like children, but there are also instances when those dynamics are less clear. For instance, children are generally understood as inherently vulnerable. The question of who is a vulnerable adult is somewhat more complicated. Safeguarding challenges are impacted by wider systems of power and inequity, such as social class, gender, caste, sexuality, age, disability, ethnicity, affluence, and citizenship. And while there is the potential for all people to be victims of harm, harm can disproportionately affect minoritized groups. Safeguarding challenges also interact with the research process. For instance, the relationship between researcher and researched, between members of the research team, such as people within the research team who have different roles and levels of seniority, and the research lead, co-researchers, etc., and between researchers and the wider communities where the research is taking place. And this is true for research processes within one country, but even more so for research across international contexts. And power relations have an added dimension when the research population is dependent on research or developmental organizations for the provision of services and amenities. Safeguarding generally responds and addresses first to safeguarding risk and challenges, as well as the need of victims and survivors of harm. No research is without risk, and it is important to anticipate the risk and take steps to mitigate it. Potential risks that I thought of for participants are exploitation and abuse, renewed trauma to participants by them reliving their experiences when they talk to researchers, lack of referral pathways leading to protection needs being unmet, a breach of data protection and security, opportunity costs because they are engaging with the research, stigma because they are taking part in the research, and the potential of false hopes due to perceived benefits. Then there's also risk for researchers, including risk of psychological harm from listening to participants. There's health, safety, and security risk, depending on where the research is being conducted. There can be a risk of burnout or distress for researchers, as well as manipulation or corruption in the area. These are just some examples. In terms of addressing the needs of victims and survivors of harm, it is important to take a victim and survivor-centered approach and to listen and take the concerns seriously and provide appropriate support for individuals who have experienced harm. And one way of ensuring or doing that is to build positive relationships with accessible organizations that ensure that survivors or victims are accessing the services and support that they need. There are three pillars to safeguarding. The first is anticipate challenges, the second is to mitigate them, and the third is to address them. As far as possible, challenges should be anticipated, and working collaborative with diverse partners and advisors can ensure that by gathering information on all the potential harms that the research could inevitably create or exacerbate. In terms of mitigating the challenges, one should take action and put processes in place to mitigate the harms that have been identified. And then if harm does occur, it needs to be addressed by taking action to ensure adequate processes to report, investigate, and provide redress for any safeguarding harms that have arisen. Some of you might already have safeguarding guidelines or policies in place. Others might have policies related to child protection, prevention of sexual harassment, child labor, etc., which might not be explicitly labeled or classified as safeguarding, but include safeguarding concerns. And I think there's a debate to be had around what constitutes a safeguarding concern and how this may differ from health and safety and ethical concerns. And there are clearly some overlaps. For example, does a research team member's risk of experiencing crime or violence represent a safety and security issue or a safeguarding issue? If a participant is distressed by a research encounter, is that a safeguarding issue or an ethical issue? And there's general acknowledgement that some of these concerns fall into multiple categories and might need to be covered by multiple protocols, which is generally a good thing because it means that safeguarding conversations trigger wider ranging considerations of transparency, accountability, and ethical research practice. Since vulnerability is context specific and risks are not experienced equally, approaches to prevent and address safeguarding concerns need to be sensitive to the changing contexts in which research takes place. It is not practical or feasible to prescribe exactly how individuals or organizations should behave, as there's no one-size-fits-all approach or solution to safeguarding. And therefore, we need to continuously reflect on our procedures. And in line with that, we also need to consider our own positions of power in making the decisions on what constitutes safeguarding. There may further be tensions between our values and those of the research community. For instance, varying norms may prevent a community member from perceiving someone I would consider vulnerable as at risk. And it is critical to make sure that the agenda and processes that are being developed for safeguarding speak to the realities and concerns of the researched community. In order to do that, it is helpful to have participatory processes that create opportunities to include different perspectives, including those of more marginalized groups that are important in informing our understanding of safeguarding and the development and implementation of action plans. According to UKI guidance, safeguarding processes should support project teams in navigating complex situations and power dynamics and help teams be responsive to vulnerabilities and safeguarding concerns. The policies the UKI has set out have the expectation that all individuals involved in research that they fund have a role in creating safe and inclusive research environments. They should protect the rights of all individuals involved in the research. Moreover, organizations should take an organizational-wide approach to prevention, have trainings in place and reporting procedures to ensure safeguarding, and generally promote a culture in which harm and abuse is less likely to happen. There's a number of different helpful guidance graphics available from the UKI, some of which I've copied into this presentation. I'm not going to read them out to you now, but there's really helpful guidance in terms of questions you can ask yourself when you plan and implement the research about whether you are considering safeguarding. And they are specified differently depending on what member of the team, what member of the research team is asking the question. So there's a number of them for the leads of the research team, for members of the research team. There's some for administrators, research participants, and I've copied them in here so that after the presentation today, you can go back to them once we've uploaded it and have a look at them. Even though we support safeguarding principles, there may be concerns about how to put them into practice or to know what good safeguarding practices look like on the ground. And I was hoping that some of you might have some examples of safeguarding practices that you can share to help us get a sense of how to approach safeguarding issues as we plan and conduct research. Is there anyone from the Rights to Time leadership team who could share an example based on their research?
I can start. I mean, it feels daunting to be described as best practice, but I've got an example from practice anyway. So I did work in a post-conflict setting, and we were interviewing people in the communities that they were both from, and also communities that they had essentially been at civil war with. So it was really important. These are very highly integrated communities where the boundaries between the kind of warring geographies aren't apparent if you don't know the area. So as a partial outsider, I knew the area quite well, but I didn't know it really well. So as a partial outsider, you're coming in trying to spot where those very porous boundaries are between communities and trying to make sure that, so this was just to work out the location for an appropriate location for the interview itself. And you're trying to weigh up a lot of different things so that they feel safe and able to give their best kind of contribution to the research. And also very conscious that if someone spotted them talking to someone from outside, that might put them at risk. So kind of protecting their interest in that way. But at the same time, trying to balance up different degrees of privacy. So they felt more comfortable in a very public place because, you know, they didn't know me all that well. So they didn't want to go to kind of a private room with me. But then in those very public spaces like a cafe, it's quite difficult then to be heard, and people might overhear you when you're telling really difficult certain situations and some really quite sensitive information as well about that might get them into trouble or even me into trouble as well, thinking about keeping everyone safe and not just your participants. So for a single interview, actually, it took a really long time to work out what the safest, most appropriate location was to do that interview in. And often we worked with, like, here's a few options. Do any of these options work? Just because that narrows down the choice and it helps focus people's minds instead of saying, well, where's best for you? Because that puts all of the onus back onto them to work out all of these quite complex issues that you're working through in your own head. So I think we did it more or less successfully. There was one, as it maybe was intimating, there was one in a cafe that was a bit of a tricky one because at various points you had to kind of pause while someone walked past because you didn't want to be overheard. And the tape of that interview was terrible because it was so noisy in there. But I think that's another point, is you learn as you go along when you're doing this stuff as well, and that's okay sometimes. That's my example.
Yeah, really interesting. And also requires a certain level of flexibility in terms of like time and planning the research, right? Because you probably didn't anticipate that it would take you that long to figure out where to talk to people.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about where I felt safe as well. I think that was a really important lesson, that, you know, some of the areas I didn't feel all that safe in as well, which was a good indicator.
Do we have other examples?
I'm happy to go, Kiki.
Thanks.
I'm going to try to turn my camera on. My internet's not so great today. Hello, lovely to see everyone. I'm not sure, again, if these are best practice, but they are examples of interesting safeguarding issues that came up in the field. One that's really, really stuck with me is one about thinking through what happens to organizations and communities after you go as a researcher. So whether you are from far away, in this case, I'm thinking about Kenya. So me coming from the UK, there's certain expectations, the way that I sound American, so certain expectations that people might have about what resources I have or what the benefits might be of participating in research. And that, I think we're all kind of well on the same page about. But one thing that I think just really struck me on my first field trip was that it's very important to think through what happens to organizations when you leave, because those expectations that others in the community, the people that we're doing research with, or people who know that I'm there doing research, who aren't participating in the study directly, but realize that it's taking place, those expectations then rub off on partners that I'm collaborating with. And so, for instance, if I do things that are not in keeping with the mission of the organization, or if they are not aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization, or if I make promises that I can't keep, or I suggest that I might be able to offer something as a result of people participating, when I go, if I fail to deliver on any of those things, or if people have false expectations about what I'm bringing to the table, then who bears the brunt of that? Well, it's the community organization and the research participants. And that, I think, is something that I'm always thinking about. It's not so much like, well, it is very much about the practice of carrying out research, but it's always thinking about partners and what comes later and what happens to partners because they collaborate with me, what happens afterwards with their expectations around further funding. I mean, I think you have to have just really open and frank conversations about managing expectations when you're out there doing field work, and then thinking about how projects are going to conclude and how they're going to conclude and what comes next for those organizations, so that you do no harm. to the individuals involved or to the organizations and their standing in the community. The other kind of thing that stuck out was in Kosovo, interviewing NGOs that are working with the survivors from the war that was there 20 years ago. And the organizations, many of them were all too ready to wheel out survivors to speak with me. Like, I'll get you in touch with a survivor. And again, I think some of the expectation was around thinking about the resource I might bring or the things I might be able to do politically, none of which I could really realistically achieve or be helpful in. I was really just there trying to understand the situation to then scope what kinds of projects we might do to raise awareness and raise the profile of the people that I was meeting with there. So it was really, really important to be very clear about within myself about what might constitute exploitation. Like, I don't need to speak with a survivor. I don't need to put a survivor through that, because what would be the benefit to them for having disclosed a very painful memory with me? Like, what am I gonna do to benefit them? So to like really be on guard for what are people proposing to give to you, because you might actually be taking something away from the community, is what I learned personally. And I'm sure you all have had similar experiences, but it was just good to share that.
Really good, Heather. Yeah, thanks for talking about managing expectations, which is so important. Yeah, so let's not call it best practice examples, but safeguarding in practice and experiences, potential difficulties. Does anyone else have an experience they would like to share?
Christy, I think I can share one of the things that is a best practice that we are doing at Azadi. So our commitment to safeguarding is guided by our values, and we believe that we should always promote well-being, and it is through the actions of ensuring well-being that we prevent abuse. So our promotion of well-being means that we are not waiting for harm to happen, but rather we are proactively creating a space where it's easy for people to recognize harm. And the way in which we are working through this, for example, in the project that we are doing now, and in other projects that we do within the organization, is that we ensure that there are resources and tools available. Like, for example, for this one, we have art therapy as part of the research that we are doing, so that the participants are provided for tools by well-being professionals, so that in case anything shows up, because we recognize that the people that we work with have gone through trauma in one way or another, so that if anything shows up, then they're able to have the skills that they need to go through it. And then the other thing that we are doing is that we have incorporated also an aspect of psychological debrief, so that on a needs basis, so we have sessions for the whole group, not only the participants, but also staff who are engaged in the project. Yes.
That's really great to hear. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's great to get an understanding of what all of our partners are doing to address these issues and where we can learn and adapt some of these ideas. Any other examples before we move on?
Hello, everyone. Just quickly want to share, our last experience that we had when we went on our first research trip. In one of the, let me call it, war zones in Boya. We didn't think that made us revise, how we perceive harm even for our own selves. Because we went there and we noticed that, for example, we hadn't on the appropriate shoes, for, to be able to run, if in case you needed to run. We noticed that as well, that we didn't look at the weather foresight, and it was a windy and a flooding day, and it made us not to be able to attain our objectives. We had 3 interviews, 3 people that we had to interview on that day. And finally, we had just 1 interview because we were stuck, with rain. And actually, we found ourselves doing what we didn't plan to do, which was rescuing the state from being flooded. So we started, trying to unblock the holes so that the space wasn't flooded. But I mean, it's really important, as well to go through the weather forecast, to think about appropriate equipment. Are you wearing the right shoes, the right trousers for such field work? I mean, I just wanted to highlight that as well, because it was quite an important thing that we didn't think about for first trip.
Thanks for sharing that, Chantal. Yeah, so that was both a safeguarding as well as a health and safety issue. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to share? There's going to be plenty of opportunity to discuss this in breakout rooms as well. So let's move on for now. Sorry, my presentation is not changing slides. That's okay. I can do it. I can do it without the slide. The last point I wanted to make before we move on to breakout rooms is that there are many different ways to address safeguarding, with safeguarding itself being a term that isn't widely used internationally. Other terms such as exploitation and harm that share similar values to safeguarding are actually more widely discussed, which means that the wealth of experience in relation to safeguarding among researchers in international contexts, particularly low and middle income countries, is not always being considered in UK protocols. And thus there's a question of whether UK protocols like the one by the UKI that we looked at on safeguarding are actually applicable to those contexts, or whether they ignore locally owned safeguarding agendas and commitment to safeguarding principles. And this question is especially important since the recent focus on safeguarding has largely been driven by UK-based donors who know relatively little about the realities of vulnerabilities on the ground. So one of the questions I'd like you to consider in the breakout rooms is whether safeguarding is the appropriate term to use, as well as who has that safeguarding expertise. How can we make sure that safeguarding agendas are co-developed by research communities and the most marginalized, not by funders in the global north? And there's a number of other questions that we would like you to focus on, and I'm hoping that Anela will create breakout rooms and then put those questions in the chat. Can you do that, Anela?
Yeah, ready when you are.
Great. We'll take about 15 minutes and then we get back together and discuss some of those questions, hopefully coming up with a joint understanding of some of the concepts that we have been describing, to see if we have similar or different views on them. Okay, go on, Ella. Thanks. I'm going to share my screen again, so we've got the questions in front of us. Right. Would one person from each breakout room briefly share what they've discussed, and if there's anything that's relevant to the network in terms of us maybe developing our own kind of safeguarding definition, or policies that are co-developed by all of our views and experiences.
Always happy to start, but also very happy for someone else to go if they want.
I think you're muted, Ben.
Oh, am I?
No, no longer. Yes.
Okay, I'm happy to start. Also happy for
Yes,
someone else to
please.
go if they prefer. Yeah, well, I kick off. So we
Thanks.
had some really interesting discussions and a real depth, I think, of different approaches. On terminology, lots of different terms being used, encompassing things like just good practice, safety, do no harm, human rights-based approach, thinking about our well-being as an interesting way into it, and ethics, I think we discussed as well. So loads and loads of different terms being used to get maybe different angles and different segments of the safeguarding question. So we talked a lot about both policy and practice, I suppose, on how this looked in an organization as well as what it looked like on paper. There's a really interesting idea about the way you practice what you're doing as being quite protective. So if you're doing things in the right way, that's already could be setting up. So almost the design of what you're doing being really useful in preventing abuses and things going wrong and just putting people in vulnerable positions, which I thought was a really interesting one. Sometimes just the basics are really important. So there was someone mentioned how important it is when you're traveling somewhere that you're making sure that everyone's safe. You know, sometimes maybe we overcomplicate, and it's just the basics of getting somewhere safely and being safely there that can be really important. And then we discussed a bit about what it looks like in a policy, and again, some really good ideas I'll just quickly go through. So one was zero tolerance, which I thought was a good, powerful idea, thinking about power dynamics between groups, thinking about the breadth of things that a good safeguarding policy needs to cover. It can't just be, you know, things that happen out in the field. It can't just be things that happen in the organization. It's got to be everything, and it's got to hold our welfare in tension with, or together with, not in tension. It's actually constituent of the welfare of our participants and the welfare of the communities we're working with. But we've got to be keeping both going together. And we had a few ideas along that same idea of how wellness of researchers links to wellness of the communities we're working with, etc. And the last word, which may be a good word to finish on, was a responsibility. So responsibility to protect and responsibility for others. And quite strongly from quite a few of what people were saying.
Thanks, Ben. Great summary. Did we have 3 groups in total, Anela? Is that right? 2 groups? 2 groups. So I guess the other group would be mine. Is there anyone from my group who would like to share? Rasha, I saw you typing notes.
So I think for our group, a lot of it was similar to what you were saying, Ben. And I think we spent a bit of time talking about practices, I think, essentially. And for the most part, and to me, this was a really critical part of doing research out in the field that is really critical, which is that safeguarding your researchers is really essential. So I think a lot of times when we're writing proposals and thinking of ethics and safeguarding, we think about the participants essentially, and then we're sort of a second thought. But when you're actually out in the real world and there's safety issues, so there are several examples given where there was either political issues or physical safety and things like that, where it was really critical to manage and really in practical words and practical ways, you know, in terms of scheduling and how people go out into the field and when to do it. And in terms of, you know, where there's political issues, making sure that there's no leaks and things like that. I hope I'm doing justice to the group when I'm sort of paraphrasing and grouping the different things together. But I think the safety of the researchers themselves is really critical. And sometimes I think that gets overlooked when we're talking about safeguarding. And then there was, in terms of, I think we talked to young participants in an occupied area and how that's, you know, so it's sort of layers of vulnerability, if I can rephrase it. And that came through really importantly in how I think we have to consider those types of layers. Kiki, did I leave anything out? Was that?
I think you did great. But if there's anyone else from our group who would like to add all of the interesting points that were made, please feel free. We also didn't get around to discussing all the questions. We've got another few minutes now to do it if anyone would like to pick up on the last ones.
So we didn't get around to the last question either about where would we report or how would we report. So that might be useful, I think, for all of us if we didn't get around to that one, just to have a quick chat about that one. Anyone
It's
got any?
hopefully something that most of us have not had to do many times in the past. So if we don't know, then that's good. Does anyone have an experience regarding to with regards to reporting that they can share?
I think I can share. So in our organization, we have a safeguarding officer. So in case there's a safeguarding issue, someone reports directly to the safeguarding officer. The person who has been offended can report. If you are a person who has witnessed a safeguarding issue happen, you can also be the one to report. So once a report is done, then the allegation is investigated. And as the investigations happen, the person who, the alleged, is temporarily suspended until the investigation is complete. And in all this time, like the person who reported, the person who was offended, and the alleged perpetrator are all treated with respect until the case is closed. So during the investigation, records are made and they are filed confidentially. And also in the process, like the board of the organization is conferred with in every step of the process. And if a person is, for example, found liable, then there are disciplinary measures that come after that. And if it's something that where the law has been breached, then we also engage the law enforcement. This has never happened at least. And then after the investigation is complete, then if there is need for counseling for the victim and the accused, then external counseling is provided. So that is how we go about reporting, and that is what happens after a report has been done.
That's really great insight to have. Thank you. We're almost at the end. Are there any final comments? Maybe also considerations for the network moving forward about in terms of what we should do to make safeguarding a continuous conversation. Yes, please go ahead. Chantal, that was you, right?
Oh, yes, yeah. I wanted to share an experience, and I want to know your views on that. I mean, it's concerning like reciprocation, you know, like we say, you know, last time in Buea, we did interview an elderly, actually a magistrate who has been, you know, locked up for 9 months, and now he left it with a lot of illness and all that. And we interviewed him, and we're so glad because, you know, for a long time he's been very ill, but, you know, he accepted to receive, of course, he thought it's very important that his story is archived. And after the interview, the wife was so, you know, I mean, it's a hospitable thing here. Like people would provide you with drinks after, with some bit of peanuts. And it's something that you cannot just say no to, because it is looked down on like being impolite, you know, and it makes your host really happy. So of course we drank and we're happy. But at the same time, we felt like, oh my God, he's ill, you know, and, you know, what can we also do for him? But we know that, you know, it's not really the way to go. But another time we had an appointment with him to go through his paper archives, because he's got a lot of newspapers he has been keeping, you know, for decades now. And then we realized that it was a havoc, you know, the archive room, total havoc. And we thought, look, we are extracting information from this, and So we thought with the team that we have to look for a day and sort out these archives, you know, kind of arrange the archives. And that's for us, it's a way of also of doing something, not only for him, but for also the generations of younger people or researchers that would come and want to use these archives. Because I think one person, I don't remember if it's Christine, but it did speak about you know, people expectations. The other spaces that we've gone to, partnerships that we've, you know, with other people who've carried out a lot of research and that we want to go to in order to you know, get information from the archives. And you know, the first thing that they would ask you, like, okay, how is our collaboration going to be? You know, you're not just going to come and just extract from us. How is it going to be? And that they're not asking for money. No, they're not. They're asking, like, we have young girls, internally displaced, that we train, so that, like, you know, so we found ourselves modifying our project, which is not a bad thing because it's a research project. So we shift our workshops. A workshop that I wanted to do, for example, here in Douala, we shift it and move it to Buea and move it to Bamenda. I mean, I don't know if it's something that you also experience in the course, you know, of your research work.
I mean,
Yeah, it's also, sorry, Ben, go ahead.
I can say absolutely I've experienced similar, and actually I think the way you approached it is really good. That way of finding sometimes quite a creative way to give back without kind of going across any lines is really difficult, but it sounds like you kind of struck that balance really well. And yeah, I think I've taken similar approaches in the past as well, where you can kind of make sure that you're not being extractive, giving something back, whether that's employment or something else, experience sometimes. Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like that was a really perfect way of dealing with it, to be honest.
That's exactly why talking about it is so important, because it is often not clear what the ideal response is, which is why I really appreciate all of you being here and taking the time to share your experiences. And I hope that we can keep having that conversation and improve our understanding of what it means to do safeguarding and do it well together. Right, I think we're at the end of the session today. Thanks, everyone. I hope it's been a positive experience and might have some impact in terms of how you think about next steps. And yeah, it was good to see everyone. The next session, I think, will be on co-authorship and publishing. Is that right? You're going to get an email with more information, but it's going to be sometime in June. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.